All right. Good to be back. I think the last time I was here was January, so I come a couple times a year. I'm glad to be with this group. Also, I always mention there's a lot of kids here, and it's always exciting to see a lot of kids. And I encourage you parents to really build a consistency for your kids to come, because once you start missing a couple times that consistent, if it breaks, it's hard to come back to that habit. And I would say consistency is way more important than intensity. Somehow we think that, maybe sooner or later the kids will somehow miraculously, love Jesus. But if you don't have that consistency of bringing them, even when it's tough, you may not see that result. So I encourage you guys to continue to bring your kids, and also continue to pour into this community. Last time I preached, I think I talked about community and how it's important that before you get community, you need commitment, right? Right? I've heard of that phrase where it's like the fruit of community is born through the root of commitment. So pour into this community. You guys are in year 6 now. That means you're not babies no more, You're getting to the adult stage of the church. So it's year 6 to 16 or year 6 to 15. That's when the church actually kind of matures and grows. And then beyond that, we can talk about that later, okay? But as Pastor Shu's on sabbatical, I pray that you guys will have the time where some of you will start thinking and resting, but also some of you will start pouring into the church, back into the church, as that's what happens sometimes when pastors do take a break. Okay, we're in the book of Esther, the last 3 chapters. So we've gone through 5 parts of Esther, so I think hopefully you followed along in the book. There's 10 chapters. I will go through chapters 8, 9, and 10, and I'll conclude the story. Now, the book of Esther, there are 2 observations that I want to mention. The first is this: there's no mention of God. You guys know that. It's famous for that, right? There's no mention of God. There's not even a mention of any characteristic of God, any name of God, any derivative of a name of God. There's just no mention of God. Secondly, there's no miracles from God. There's no special divine intervention. There's not even a prayer offered here. And certainly there's no miracles, right? So sometimes what I find is the book of Esther teaches us there are 2 struggles that human beings have, and I think they're kind of embedded in the book of Esther. The first is, I don't feel God's presence. And some of you may come to church or for the first time or the 10,000th time, and you don't feel God's presence. You say, I'm going through the motions. I don't really feel anything as I come here. Secondly, I don't see God's work. So you say, well, I'm going to church, I'm doing ministry, I'm helping the children's program, I'm sitting in these pews, but I don't really connect my work with God's work. Like, I kind of just see that I'm going through life, right? Some of us have these 2 struggles. Now, if you have these 2 struggles, maybe these statements resonate with you. That's why the book of Esther was written. Because the book of Esther is designed to help us see that God's silence does not equate to his absence. God's silence does not equate to I think it's the next slide, his absence, okay? The book of Esther illustrates a theological concept, and I am recapping for those that probably missed a couple sermons. But it's really this concept of the providence of God. Now, what is the providence of God? It is this: God's faithful and effective care. I like this definition. And guidance of everything which he has made toward the end which he has chosen. Now think about that for a second. God is moving you from point A to point B, okay? Point A to point B, because point B is where he has envisioned your life to be. Since you were created, God said, I want this person to be here. Now, the problem is sin messes that up, right? We mess that up. And so sometimes we think life should be like God taking us from point A to point B, and it's a straight line. But in fact, a lot of it is this. There's a lot of mess in there, right? Nobody wants to talk about that middle portion. They just want to get to point B. But for God to get you to point B in this context of a sinful world, it's going to be messy. There's ups and downs. Now, Ephesians 2 chapter 10 says, we are God's handiwork, his masterpiece, right? And what does it say in that verse? Created in Christ Jesus to do good work, which he has prepared in advance for us to do. Now think about that verse for a sec, because a lot of us have that verse on our desks. It's mentioned a lot, but do we understand this verse? God is taking you from point A to point B, and the journey is messy. And yet the providence of God says God hasn't given up on you. You might be in the mess, and you might feel that I'm in the mess, and I might not even see where point B is, but God's providence in his sovereignty will take you there. Now, sometimes the catch is that we don't feel God's presence or see his work, but that does not mean he has stopped working in our lives. And that's what the book of Esther is about. You won't find a definition of the word providence in the Bible. You certainly find a demonstration of it in the book of Esther. Okay? So, as I mentioned before in my first sermon, let me just say that the author intentionally writes this story in a manner that shows the hidden hand of God at work. And I have oh, no, I think Melissa, you have to keep following. Yeah, okay, keep going. All right, okay, whatever. All right, it's just bonus, okay? You see that all the points of Esther, you start seeing things like there's a reversal in the story that happens in chapter 6, right? You see how there's a chiastic structure in Esther, that chapter 1 mirrors chapter 2, 2 to 3 mirror 8 and 9, 4 and 5 mirror 6 and 7. The whole point is that it's hidden, and yet if you look at the details and if you scrutinize the book of Esther, what you're going to find is the hidden hand of God is actually at work. And that's what I'm trying to teach everybody here today, that sometimes we look with our physical eyes and we say, I don't know if God's working. And you listen with your physical ears. But what the book of Esther is telling you to do is dig deeper. Think through the possibilities of what God might be doing, even though you physically cannot see or audibly cannot hear God. Okay? That's important because most of the time we don't see miracles from God. And you may not feel a certain way about God. And yet, does that mean God is not working? I don't think so, right? Now here in chapter 8, what's really interesting is, you see the providence of God displayed. Okay, it's no longer hidden. And then this is a vital point, that there's a point in your life where you see it come together, right? And then you're like, yes, God is working. But the problem is, a lot of times you don't get to that point, or you give up too early, okay? So let's go through it, chapter 8, verses 1 and 2, and then we'll kind of get right into it. So if you look in your Bible, basically the story gets to the point where Haman's dead, right? They kill Haman off, and Esther, in chapter 8, verses 1 and 2, you see here, she's given his state. Mordecai's elevated to position number 2, so he's very high ranking now, and becomes a state manager. Now, if you keep going, the problem is there's still an issue that remains, and the edict is the issue. The edict is still in effect. So what does Esther do? Now, if you look at the Bible, verse 3, it says, Esther again pleaded with the king, falling at his feet and weeping, and she begged him to end the evil plan of Haman, which he had devised against the Jews. Then the king extended the golden scepter to Esther, and she arose and stood before him. And she said, if it pleases the king, and if he regards me with favor and thinks it is the right thing to do, and he is pleased with me, let an order be written overruling the dispatches of Haman, devised and wrote to destroy all the Jews in the king's provinces. Now, verse 6 is really kind of touching. She says, how can I bear to see the disaster fall on my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my family? And so what happens right here is that there is a reversal of what happens, right? Like there's a new edict in place that allows the Jews to defend themselves. So that's exactly what happens. And if you read this entire chapter, what you see in the very end is that there's a celebration because the word of the edict travels throughout the lands and people start worshiping. And in verse 17, it says this. Look at verse 17 for a sec. It says, in every province and in every city to which the edict of the king came, there was joy and gladness among the Jews, with feasting and celebrating. And many of the people of the other nationalities became Jews because of the fear of the Jews had seized them. Now that's the closest people say that God is mentioned in this text, the fear of the Jews. But there was enough awe and something miraculous that happened that people started turning from their pagan ways to worship the God of the Jews. Okay? Now, if Esther concluded here, it is a fairy tale ending, right? It's the good guys win, the bad guys lose. You are in a movie theater right now. You watch movies about that all the time. right? It's like, why would I want to watch a movie where things don't end well, right? You come out of theater and usually tell people that was depressing, because I come to a movie to escape my life, right? And that's the book of Esther in many ways if you end it here in chapter 8. But the problem is there are chapters 8 and 9 and 10 left. Now, what do you make of 9 and 10? And I think it's important that we understand that, because it has to do with our lives. See, we know many stories where God reverses the outcome. He takes the worst and makes it the best. And if I were to just leave you there, then Christianity is really kind of very unrealistic in the sense that all things work out well and sooner or later it'll be good. Yeah, but what about chapters 8, 9, and 10 of your life? See, the temptation you and I face is that we jump to the chapter 8 of our lives, so the so-called chapter 8 of our lives, and we want to stay there. Right? We just want the providence of God to be displayed. And you're just praying for that. And you're like, God, if you can get me there, I will believe in you and I'll love you and I'll believe everything Christianity says is true. And yet, I think there are chapters 9 and 10 of our lives. And I'll explain that later. But to experience the power and presence of God, you need not just to look for the outcome, but embrace the journey. Right? Like, we are outcome obsessed. We're resolution obsessed. And if you don't believe me, just consider the contents of your prayer life, right? Especially when you're in trouble, right? What are the contents of your prayer life? Most of our prayer lives, I would say, revolve around this idea of, God, would you resolve my situation? Would you take away the pain? Would you solve this issue in my life? And we pray and pray and pray, especially when you feel it, right? When, and I don't blame you. I've been there too before, obviously. If your child goes wayward in their faith, if you are suffering a job loss, if you're in physical pain, of course you're praying these type of prayers, right? But to know the power and presence of God, you need to change your prayers from, would you simply resolve my situation, to a prayer of that honors the journey. You know, God, would you transform me in this process, right? That's a deeper type of prayer. And that's a prayer that we would love to, I think we need to pray, right? Would you, ask yourself questions like this. What are you trying to teach me in this situation, Lord? And pray accordingly, right? How are you asking me to grow in this situation? Like, that's the sign of mature faith. When you're able to ask these type of questions with a sort of calmness in your heart, right? If your prayer is basically a panic button type of prayer, I'm just pressing this panic button, then you're living a very shallow Christianity. I think, people that mature in their faith are open to the possibilities of what God might be doing in this situation, right? I was saying, the word I'm looking for is really perseverance, right? And, really, it's really a combination of two concepts. One is, you have to have the right perspective in life, right? But also you have to have the right proximity, right? And patience. And I think something I've learned is perseverance is not one of these concepts where you just push through life and have grit. I think Christian perseverance is really, is when you are close to God, you stay close to God, right? And that gives you the right perspective, by the way, and it gives you the right passions and the right purpose. But then also, you should not undervalue patience. It takes time. You have to stay the course. And I think, most young people, the problem is they understand the first concept. Like, if I tell them that you need to stay close to God, so they'll do the devotions, they'll pray, they'll ask some questions of God. But the problem is we don't teach them resilience, which is the second concept. Patience. And I think only when you grow older with age and you go through difficult times and you get beaten down by life, that's when you get patience, right? And I would say don't fear those times, because God is trying to teach you patience. Why? Because ultimately, to persevere through life, you need both to stay close to God and you need patience. You need to stay the course, right? And that takes time and that takes effort. See, next slide here is, you've seen this kind of diagram before, but I didn't really know this, but it takes bamboo a long time to grow. And the first 5 years, it looks like that. And then subsequently after, it exponentially grows in the next 6 weeks. Now, the problem is most Christians get stuck here. They're like, I don't see nothing. Right? I don't see what's going on here. I just see a little thing, right? They don't see that if given enough time, staying the course, you'll see growth in your life. And you'll see the fruit of that growth come out in your life. Right? You see, there's 2 more chapters in the book of Esther. That's what I'm trying to get at. That you can jump to happy endings and want to stay there, but you know that's not true. In fact, if you just aim for that, you'll be forever chronically frustrated because you know in your mind and in your heart, there are other things coming. It's another mess the next day. When I wake up, there'll be more problems. When you get older, it compounds, right? Because now you have children and now you have a job that requires more of you. And those things just compound in your life. You're taking care of more and you're taking care of more people. So if you're just looking for the resolution, you're going to be chronically frustrated, okay? If you look at chapter 9, let's go through it real quick, okay? But what happens is the day of the decree comes and the Jews attack. They, in verses 1 to 2, they destroy Haman's family and the Persian officials who joined them in their plot. And then what happens in verse 13 is Esther actually asks for a second day of vengeance. Okay, this is kind of crazy. But she decides to kill all of Haman's family and then publicly humiliate them. And so it's kind of that's like not mentioned in Sunday school, but it is truly something that happens in the book of Esther, right? Finally, in verses 24 to 26, they actually hold a feast to commemorate their deliverance from destruction. And the name of the feast, of course, ironically, is Purim, which means dice, right? Die, right? The little roly thing. And that is an ironic reversal of what happens because remember, months ago, Haman rolled a die to determine the day the Jews would get killed. So now they have a feast of die, right? Now, again, what chapter 9 is showing you is that it's kind of messy. Like, it's not all like a fairy tale ending, right? It's kind of messy. And if you go to chapter 10, nobody wants to preach from this chapter, but it's, like, I gotta tell you, the book ends on a very mundane note. There are mentions of taxes and the king is still on the throne. Xerxes has not moved away. He's not a good king, by the way. He's like kind of a passive, king. He's not really good, but he's still in charge. And it's a reminder, chapter 10 is a reminder for us, I think, that there is still the rules of others over our lives, and that you still live in a fallen world, right? It's not a happy fairy tale ending. It teaches us something important, that we are still sinners living in a fallen world, in a sinful world. And heartbreakingly, I think the world of Esther is a reminder of our world today, that there is still sin, that God seems silent sometimes, that evil appears to triumph, that people struggle to live out their faith, often messing up and failing in their attempts. And so the lesson, therefore, is not, be like Esther, right? And everything will work itself out. I think the problem is a lot of people read this passage and like, you just have to teach our children, our girls to be like Esther, And certainly Esther is a example for some of us to follow. My mom's name is Esther, right? But Esther is not a virtuous moral example, and she's not the hero of the story. She's someone used by God, even in her brokenness, to do the things of God. And do it probably not exactly the way I would even say God wanted it, right? But she still was able to do that. Now, if you look at her story, she hides her Jewishness. She abandons Jewish laws. She dresses in the trappings of the Persian Empire. Her name is derived from a Persian god. She wins the favor of the king by pleasing him more than other women. She actually calls for the public shaming of Haman's sons, in an act of vengeance. So what I'm getting at here is the lesson is not be like Esther and everything will work itself out. It's really God can still do good even when we do wrong, so stay the course. I think that's the takeaway from Esther. That God can still do good And in fact, he can still do good through you, even though you're a sinner and you mess up. So continue to do what God wants you to do, even though you might not do it perfectly. That's the point. Michael Fox, who wrote a commentary on Esther, I like what he said here. He said, now read it carefully. When we scrutinize the text of Esther for traces of God's activity, okay, you gotta look, in other words. You gotta have a magnifying glass and look. We are doing what the author made us to do. That's the point, he says. The author would have us probe the events we witness in our own lives in the same way. He is teaching us I like this term, theology of possibility. The willingness to face history with an openness to the possibility of divine providence, even when history seems to weigh against its likelihood, as it did in the dark days of Haman's decree. In this way, the book offers a stance of profound faith. Now, what does he mean by a theology of possibility? I think it's something that I never really thought about until I read this book. Maybe you haven't thought about. It's this idea that you have to, you're stuck in this middle section between what you know and how God plays it out, right? And do you believe in the mess of life that God is still good, that God is still sovereign, that God is still working things out to good effect in your life? Because a lot of people, the problem is they get in this middle section, they just abandon God. And they just give up on church. And they don't read their Bibles. They don't pray. And they don't really care because they think God has abandoned them. God is silent, therefore he's absent, right? See, a theology of possibility, I think, involves two things. Number one, you're trying to learn to spot the activity of God, right? Knowing that God is working for you. And a lot of people are bad at spotting the activity of God. They just see what they want to see. Right? And they give bad advice. When someone brings them a problem, they don't really know why God is doing what he's doing, right? They can't, and that takes time and patience, like I said. But the other thing I would say I want to focus on is not just learning to spot the activity of God, learning to join the activity of God. Why? Because when you join the activity of God, it means you actually believe God is still working, yeah? Don't sit on the sidelines, in other words, and say, well, I guess we'll just live through life and hopefully, God will take me to heaven one day. That's not the point. I would say there's the joining of the activity of God in the book of Esther, amounts to two different things, that I see in this book. That's repeatedly, the theme is repeated, which is number one, the seeking of justice, and number two, the act of feasting or the act of celebrating. Right? Remember the book starts and ends with a feast. And throughout the book, it's really about Esther's journey to use whatever power she has to invoke justice for her people. And to me, those are two things that we ought to pour our lives into. Seeking justice for people and celebrating the good things of God. Even though we may not do neither of these things perfectly, right? So let's go through the first one, seeking justice. Esther sought justice. She used everything in her power and at her disposal to invoke justice. Now, what is justice? There is a difference between revenge and justice, and I just want to highlight that because revenge is really characterized by a desire for blood, to see your enemies suffer. It's a very emotional, response to something that has happened to you. So you say, you know what? I've suffered. I want them to suffer, right? And I will make sure that I will do whatever I can to make them suffer as I have suffered, right? That's revenge. Now, justice is a different concept. Justice is giving a person their due. It's less of an emotional response, right? If a reward is appropriate, they're to be rewarded. If punishment is appropriate, they're to be punished. That's the point, right? And God gives human beings this call to invoke justice where we can, right? Of course, the famous passage in the Bible is Micah chapter 6, verse 8. Some people, it's in their homes, right? Some people tattoo this verse on their body, but it says, He has shown you, O human being, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God, right? And so you see a bunch of concepts here that are related. The first concept you see I want to highlight is to love mercy. The word there is chesed, which means unwavering commitment and love and kindness. So that's an attitude, but it also says to act justly. The word there is mishpat, right? Which means giving people their due, whether punishment or protection. And so the idea here is that mishpat really emphasizes the action, what you're supposed to do, but chesed emphasizes the attitude behind the action, right? We enact justice because we love people. Whether they need to be punished or they need to be protected, we love people. And in the Bible, what you find is these concepts are often related to those who need it the most, right? Zechariah chapter 7 verse 10 is traditionally known as the verse that talks about the quartet of the vulnerable in society. So in the Bible, what you notice is, God often talks about 4 groups of people, right? The widow, the fatherless, the foreigner, the immigrant or the exile, and the poor, right? So the widow didn't have anything, the orphan, the fatherless, the immigrant didn't have anything, and the poor doesn't have anything. And it seems that God emphasizes that justice should be given to those 4 people primarily, right? And you see that in the book of Esther, right? That the Jews were not just in exile, but they had no voice. They were about to be killed. So Esther invokes justice. She does whatever she can in her power, even though you can question how she got to that position of power, but she becomes queen and she uses that power to save her people. Now, God has put you in a position to pursue justice as well. And you might say, well, I don't know. And in fact, I don't even know what I'm doing. But isn't that the point? The point is that you will not do it perfectly, but God will use your efforts in providence, right? He will use it to his effect. So I think here's how you should think about enacting justice. You must work out in practice what has already been accomplished in principle. And that's something else I've learned as I've studied Esther, that if you look at this book, Haman was humiliated and killed in chapter 6. He was hung in chapter 7. So the enemy's actually defeated, right? He's dead. But it took a while for them to work out the implications of that. The redemption had to be worked out in practice, and for that word of redemption to go to every corner of the kingdom. And in so many ways, that's precisely what you and I face today, that Jesus has defeated the enemy in principle, and all that remains is for that redemption to be worked out and for that redemption to go to every corner of planet Earth. That's why Jesus said, go everywhere and make disciples of all nations. Right? Because he says, look, I've defeated death. You don't have to do it again, right? It's already done. But I need you to go tell people. And I need you to work out the implications of that for planet Earth. Now, one day I'm going to come back again, and it's going to be magnificent and powerful and dramatic and sudden. But you need to work out in practice what I've done already in principle. Right? Look at Romans chapter 13 for a second. Paul says it this way in verses 12 to 14. He says, the night is almost gone. The day of salvation will soon be here. So he says, look, remove your dark deeds like dirty clothes, right? Take those off and put new clothes on, new shining armor of right living. Because why? Because you belong to the day. You want to indicate that you belong to the day. We must live decent lives for all to see. Now, Paul is saying we're living at the time of dawn, essentially, right? The light is arriving, the night is fading, right? You start seeing it, right? And he says, as Christians, you need to live at dawn, as citizens of a new kingdom, reflecting the light of Christ around you, right? And that's why you need to seek justice. You see what I'm saying? Like one day Jesus will make it all right. But right now, he's giving us a chance to join him in his mission to make things new and right. And he starts with your heart, first of all, right? Then you extend outward through everything you have to do it. Now, I think at this point, let's spend a little bit of time talking about that. First of all, you might say, well, what is justice? I encourage you to read that book by Tim Keller, the late Tim Keller, called Generous Justice. I think it gives us a good overview of what that looks like. Maybe you can think about it, but the basic premise of that book is that those with power must be catalysts of change, because those without power can often not speak for themselves, right? And so he's saying that if you have power, and everybody has a power to a degree, you have influence, you have resources, you ought to use them for the benefit of other people, not for just the benefit of yourself, right? But to build a better world that God has envisioned it. And he uses a few categories. Let me list them really quickly. You can read the book. The first category is the category of relief, right? And when we think of justice, we think of that, right? That's what Esther basically did. Relief is meeting physical, immediate needs of people, right? Economic needs. And the big example is the Good Samaritan, right? Because this guy provided relief. He gave physical protection. He gave a rent subsidy. He gave medical treatment. That's a form of justice, right? And that's what probably Esther focused on. Not this type of relief. The relief of not dying, right? So she did that. The second thing that Esther did was what falls in the category of advocacy, right? Advocacy is a more assertive form of relief, in which people in need are given active assistance to find legal aid and housing and protection from abuse and violence, right? So Esther focused on relief and advocacy. And I think churches need to get involved in these two areas, right? Relief, helping fit real needs immediately. That's why our church, you're going to hear that when there is disasters around the world, we give we use our benevolence fund to give immediately to people for relief efforts, literally. Advocacy, something that we need to think about as well. Development is the third category. Development is giving an individual or family or a community what they need to move beyond dependency on relief to a condition of self-sufficiency, right? So it's the whole concept of teaching a person to fish, not just fishing for the person, right? But that is an area that some of you might be involved in your jobs, or maybe you're passionate about. You see relief, advocacy, development, and then lastly, which is the hardest one to do, reform. Reform is moving beyond all of that and seeking to change the conditions and social structures that cause these problems in the first place. Now, my point is just explaining that justice involves different things, right? Now, you can enact all these four things in different areas of life, right? Like, think about even your own communities or people in need in your neighborhood, right? You're going to provide relief, hopefully. But hopefully, you're going to try to help them along the way so that you're not just constantly providing relief. You're trying to help them become self-sufficient. Trying to connect them to a church community where other brothers and sisters can help them, eventually develop them that they can be people that bless other people, right? Now, I'm just giving you an overview here, but in our church, we call our way of doing it the peace plan, right? And obviously, we've talked about this in the past. This is not, I would say, a definition of justice, but a strategy by which we try to invoke justice in different communities around the world, right? So you've heard from the Nepal team, but essentially, on the right-hand side are the difficult things, we call them the global giants. These are things that affect every single country and every single nation, every community around the world, right? There's spiritual emptiness, there's egocentric leadership, extreme poverty, there are pandemic type of diseases, and there's a lack of education. And the peace plan is the PEACE, right? We're trying to do these things. Now, I don't want to go through them in depth, but that's what we try to do, right? DTM, by the way, really is the first P. You're trying to plant a site where it is not directly physically located right beside the Bayview site. Why? Because you believe that Markham has unique needs, right? That's the point. You live in Markham, right? It's a little bit different. Eventually, we'd love to plant elsewhere as well, right? We're working with churches in Nepal. There's a new project for South Africa happening soon, or that area of the world. But the whole idea is that you plant gospel centers of hope whereby people gather and can bring justice and love and hope to their communities, okay? Now, I'm only saying this because I think that's where our church is going. We're trying to be a church that does look at this very seriously in different ways, right? Now, we're not going to do perfectly, right? And sometimes we'll get criticized because, well, you're not doing A, B, C, D, E, F, G. But my point is, if you do A, B, C, we're moving in the right direction, right? So some churches come to gather for worship, and that's it. And I'm saying you can gather for worship and you can celebrate, which is my next point. But beyond that, you need to do what God wants you to do in the community out there, right? Outside of these four walls. You need to be doing that. And you say, well, I don't know what to do. Well, start looking at the immediate needs of your friends and family first, and then let's join together as a church to do it more seriously, right? So that's something to think about. The next thing I would say is the other theme about joining the activity of God in Esther is, I would say, choosing joy, the way I've termed it, which is this idea of feasting or celebrating what God is doing. And why do I say that? Because I think it's important to understand that even though the world is broken and imperfect and you're trying to restore justice in it, you know that there is a final act of justice that will be done and there will be a celebration. So the same truth applies. We must work out in practice what has been accomplished in principle. I mean, they knew they were still under Xerxes, right? And they knew that eventually troubles would come, but they feast and dine and celebrate and tell stories of God's faithfulness to remind them to keep going. And I think that's really important. Okay, again, going out there is important to serve, to do things together, work in a team to do that. But I would also challenge you to think about what you're doing in this space right now. And all those summer socials and all that kind of stuff, what's that about? The point of that is not just to have a good time, okay? The point of that is to tell stories to each other, remind each other God's faithfulness and presence in your community. And that God is always with your community. That's the point, right? We're practicing what has been done in principle. I would say we need to recapture our joy and laughter. And sometimes Christians are too serious about why they come to church. They want this and that out of it. But really, coming to church is really this idea that I'm joining in the story of God. My story joins with God's story and the story of the people in this community. And somehow our stories work together so that we live a new, bigger story in this community. That's the point. See, Jesus has won, right? Why are we celebrating? Because God has won the battle. He has reversed our fortunes, our situations, our destinies from death to life. He is working in our lives and through our lives right now. And I would say what we're celebrating the most is the unbroken presence and power of God. You know, I started from the beginning of the sermon saying, you know, a lot of people don't see the power and presence of God. I don't see God working. I don't feel God's presence. I don't feel Him part of my life. And yet, why are we celebrating? We're celebrating that Jesus has died and resurrected, and He has given us this gift that we so much need, but we take for granted, which is the unbroken presence and power of God. Right? That you don't have to work for it or slave away for it. God's presence and power is always with you, even though you cannot see it or feel it at times. That is the point of Esther. Right? So these 10 chapters, a lot going on. But if you reread it and you kind of put it together parallel with your life, and if you were to write down your life story, you know, could you see the hidden hand of God at work? And I pray that you would have the right perspective and enough patience to start seeing that as you journey through life. I'm going to leave you with Psalm 107. It's a psalm that was written before Esther, probably a couple hundred years before. So, well, why do I say that? Because the people of Esther that understood what was happening to them would have understood Psalm 107. They probably were telling each other this psalm to encourage each other. But if you look at the psalm, it says this: give thanks to the Lord, for He is good. Right? And you say, oh, I know that, of course. His love endures forever. And you say, well, I've heard that before. But I like verse 2. Let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story, those He redeemed from the hand of the foe. Okay. Now, if you keep on reading this psalm, there's 43 verses, you start seeing it unpacked. But then I like this verse a lot. Let the one who is wise, you want to be wise, yeah? Heed these things and ponder the loving deeds of the Lord. We need to be a place where we tell our stories and ponder what God is doing. Like when you tell your story to another person in this community, I pray that they're not just like, okay, I'll pray for you. But really, we help each other process our stories and saying, well, you know, maybe God is doing this. Not in an insensitive way, but as you pray and think about it with the other person, you join in that pondering. What does pondering mean? I would actually say pondering involves two things. I'll end here. You celebrate the actions of God. That's pondering, right? I think about it. Okay, God did these things for me. But if you want to go deeper in your faith, it also means to understand or celebrate the ways of God. Now, what's the difference? The actions of God are what He has done, right? You say, well, you can list things He's done, and you do it all the time. Well, you know, I'm celebrating because my kid did this, or I got this promotion in my job, or I got healed. You ponder the actions of God. But what about the ways of God? It's why he might be doing the things he might be doing. Now that takes maturity. That's a lot harder to do. That takes patience. That takes perspective. That takes time. And that takes you to go through difficult times in your life. You have to suffer to understand that second point. Anybody can celebrate the actions of God and look to the providence of God revealed. But how many of us can understand the ways of God, understand the heart of God? That's when the providence of God is hidden. That's the true test of faith and Christian maturity. So I pray that you would be both. You would understand the actions of God. You can declare it, you can praise God, sing about it, but also in the deep, difficult times of life, when you're not sure, you can say, you know what? I still understand the ways of God. Not fully, but I start understanding his ways. Now, I might not even see exactly what he's doing or how he's doing, but I know his heart is good, and his heart is good for me. Let's pray. Take a moment to think about what I said, but more importantly, what God said. We'll invite the band to come up as well to lead us in the last song. And I pray that as you sing this song, this would just not be another like run-of-the-mill type of song, but you would say, you know what? I need to celebrate what God has done in my life and what God is continuing to do. And in fact, I got to celebrate when I don't even see those things. And I can't hear the voice of God, right? I got to keep going. So I just pray that would capture your heart today. I'll give you a moment to think as the band sets up. Maybe there's something that you're going through right now nobody, really understands. Maybe you say, I don't even know God understands, to be honest. But, maybe God is doing something. Maybe it's going to take some time to unpack. Maybe it might take months, if not a year, or maybe I know people that their prayers are answered after decades. That takes patience. Maybe that's you today. I just pray that you would be able to see through the lens of God, and that God will reassure you that he does love you.